6% of them make that grade. So we also have some problems in the public system. So I think we have to look at all of higher education in California much more critically. So let's fix the problem, but let's not be so critical of the for-profit schools, because I think they are doing a fairly good business in many cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Emerson. Any other questions or comments at this time? I've got a couple. Mr. Crawford, we have heard from Dr. Studley some suggestions, and ITT is not named by name. You're not here representing the institution, really. Just generally, you're the only panelist from the sector. Could you react to some of the suggestions you heard?
What I would say is a lot of what I understood from the prepared statements are already being addressed. With respect to public disclosures, there's a school performance fact sheet which is standardized by regulation. It was mandated under the AB 48. The specifics have, and a lot of the specifics were set forth in that bill, which, while not as prescriptive as A23, was prescriptive in its own sense. With respect to student disclosures, there is an apples-to-apples comparison. It's required by the current regulations. With respect to one of the big issues that keeps coming up is, especially with respect to the Cal grants, is the cost of attendance and the fact that, I think the clarification needs to be that the Cal grant goes to the student, and the student then makes the election as to where they want to go to college and where they want to pursue their education. It's also the majority of the people receiving the most money under the Cal grants are those very students that are at risk once they begin college, the non-traditional students. And I keep hearing the statistics about the for-profit sector has much higher default rates, has much higher, much lower completion rates, whatever metrics you want to use. Some of that is nationalized, and there's all kinds of statistics. There's also been corrections to a number of the public disclosures made by the Department of Education on the back end. I think the clear thing, and this goes exactly to what Ms. Wenzel and the Department of Consumer Affairs and Bureau have been saying, is the framework's in place. The provisions are in place to provide full disclosures to students, to provide means of redress by means of complaint policies, as well as the STRIF, the Student Tuition Refund procedure. So, and that is truly addresses instances where there's bad actors. Further, and this has been the subject of many of the AB 48 committee meetings, was there's already, for students that are aggrieved, there is other remedies. If there's fraud, you can pursue fraud outside of having to pursue it directly through the Bureau. You can go to the Attorney General's office. You can pursue it via other avenues. So some of the generic complaints that were addressed to the sector in large, I think, have already been addressed. The one I would go back to, and I think was appropriately addressed by the committee, is the fact that the framework's in place. It really has not been fully staffed yet. And again, one of the big issues in terms of trying to determine incidences where there is a need for additional investigation or additional concern would be the compliance reviews, getting the staff there, being able to go out to the schools, to physically visit the schools, and to use complaints and other mechanisms as a source of identifying and prioritizing where areas of concern are. And again, you have to realize that there is a very discrete demographic that represents the majority of the for-profit enrollments, and it's the non-traditional students. And they are the very students that are most likely to default. They're the very most students most likely to have family, work-related issues, et cetera, that stop them or prevent them from completing their education in a timely manner. And what we see as the vision, not just in California, but this has been a national discussion, quite frankly, for the last 2 years, instigated in large part by some of the initiatives in Washington. But what we have is an opportunity to look at how do we better service them. I mean, the means is to provide open access to people and allow them the opportunity to fail. And not everybody's going to succeed, and that's why it's always wonderful when you hear a success story. And I mean, We hear it all the time from our students, and anyone that sees our commercials for the ITT Technical Institutes, we have our students come back and share their success stories. So not everybody is meant to go to college. They may find that out at a for-profit institution. They may find it out at UC. They might find it out at Cal State or any of the community colleges. You've got 112. You've got a pretty large community college population out here. So within all that context, there's a lot of moving pieces. It is a complex issue. But I think the focus right now is on allowing the Bureau to work within the framework that's been established. It's been deliberated by the legislature. It's been promulgated through a very extensive and comprehensive series of rulemaking, and you've got the framework in place. Now the key is just now that it's staffed is to monitor it and assess what outcomes you see as a result of that initiative.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Studley, do you want to react to that?
Yes. This is actually the easiest doctorate I've ever gotten.
Are you not doctor?
No.
Ms. Studley.
Thank you, though. I agree with Mr. Crawford that the framework is in place, and there has been some very important attention and legislative steps and the presentations by the many state entities involved in this are important, and they tell us that we have a lot of the structures and commitments to do a good job staffing and maintaining that head of STEAM, leadership by an appointed head of the Bureau. That's the governor's job. That's important too. So there are resource issues, but there are a number of gaps in who's covered, who's just not included at all. And so to the extent that there are information requirements and the student fact sheets and the databases, we've already heard two, the bureaus, which is not yet up to speed, CSACs is yet to come. As those are done, they need to be connected and complete, and a number of schools, including regionally accredited institutions, are not covered by any of these systems, and some of the newest schools that are not part of the accreditation process aren't in there either. So we've got an example in our more extended testimony of somebody attempting to choose a medical assistant program in one of our communities. I believe we chose Santa Ana, and said, look at this dizzying array that you would have to try and plow through to understand the combination of program type, length, quality, cost, convenience, history, track record, job placement. It was a daunting job for anyone, let alone somebody who might already have a job and be taking the kids to school, to try to make headway about that. So there is a framework. There's also an opportunity, and a number of gaps needed to be filled. I'd just like to make one comment building on the performance measures, but because that is where a lot of these conversations are going, including in the legislature, which we understand is thinking about proposing that the state take a hard look at what measures should be used. Good performance measures could account for the kinds of access issues and opportunity issues that we're talking about. Don't ask me how. I'm not sure exactly how we would do it yet, but we would welcome the chance to work with you. You can include variations in population. If you said some people come from schools where the high school preparation isn't as strong, or communities where jobs are just harder to find or they don't pay as much, you could factor those in so that you could still have better performance, or judge schools in a way that reflected who they were opening the door to without having no measures at all or allowing for very weak performance outcomes.
And by the way, that doctoral degree that I conferred on you will cost you $42,000. So please see me after the meeting.
I'll have to go figure out whether it'll raise my
yeah, we don't accept Cal grants. So.
civic engagement or salary.
One more question for you, Mr. Crawford, and that'll be my last question. What is ITT doing? The default rate we've talked about, whether higher than it should be or not. What does ITT do to try to decrease default rates?
Well, I mean, in large part, there's always been a dedicated focus on explaining each student that goes through a student financial aid process. There are federal requirements, which include an exit interview, consulting, et cetera. One of the initiatives we've undertaken, a lot of proprietary colleges have undertaken, is an enhanced focus on default prevention, which is largely around communicating with students and reminding them of, the requirements to begin paying their loans once their forbearance or deferral period ends, et cetera. There's various programs available out there, that students can adopt, and I know that there's proposals or at least discussions around providing other ones. But clearly, from our standpoint, it's communicating with the students, ensuring that they understand their obligations, and then they move proactively to address those obligations. And again, depending upon the students, I mean, some students obtain employment, either during school or immediately after graduation in their field, and they go forth and they do well, and there's never an issue about their loans. Others who withdraw may, go through a period of forbearance where they decide whether or not to switch educational institutions. We have, a number of students will transfer either within the public higher education system or from a private to a public institution. So a student that leaves one institution may be contacted to pay on their outstanding loans, but if they enrolled in another institution, then that's told and they go back to continuing their education. Largely it's around educating the students to be conversant with what the requirements are for their loan repayments, when they're required to pay their loan payments, and then selecting the program that's most appropriate for their particular and individual circumstances.
Thank you very much. If there are no further questions, I'd like to thank this panel and call up our last panel of the day prior to public comment. Dr. Marshall Hill, the Executive Director of the Nebraska Coordinating Commission for Postsecondary Education, and Robert Shireman from California Competes, and a former Undersecretary at the United States Department of Education. And I'd also like to welcome Assemblyman Lara, who has joined the committee since our last panel began. Okay, thank you for being here. First, we'll go to Dr. Marshall Hill. Dr. Hill.
Thank you, Chairman Block, members of the committee. I'm your lone non-Californian today, and I'm especially appreciative of the honor. I'm not a Californian due to lack of trying. It's just never quite worked out. I'm especially honored to be here, and my thanks go to the Assembly Higher Ed Committee staff for inviting me. Since I'm not from California, I'll take a few moments to establish for you my perspective. Might be helpful for you to know the point from which I speak. I spent 18 years as a college and university faculty member, most of it in not-for-profit institutions and public institutions. Duquesne University, Utah State, Iowa State. I did 11 years of state-level work at the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, the last 8 as Assistant Commissioner for universities. We had 35 at the time, and academic health science centers, 9 of them. I was responsible for distance learning policy development, relationships with accreditors, approval of degree programs, and approval of new institutions. For the last 7 years, I've been Executive Director of the Nebraska Coordinating Commission for Postsecondary Education, the sister agency to your recently dissolved Postsecondary Education Commission. Done a good deal of work with accrediting bodies of all types, regional, national, and specialized, first as a faculty member and then through the statewide work. I've been active in regional higher education work and national organizations such as the state higher education executive officers, my counterparts around the country. I've represented the state higher education executive officers 3 times in negotiated rulemaking at the U.S. Department of Education under Mr. Shireman's tenure there. Twice dealing with negotiated rulemaking sessions on accreditation, and once on improving the integrity of federal financial aid programs. Although my comments today have been influenced by many conversations with colleagues around the country, they're mainly mine, and my colleagues would have different opinions, partly determined on how much regulation they do. I've always done a fair amount of regulation. In some states, my counterparts don't do much of it. So I'll begin my remarks with some comments on our country's so-called triad approach to overseeing institutions. By that I mean federal oversight, state oversight, such as you carry out, and accreditation. My personal views on that is I've always been a strong supporter of the triad approach. I think it's more comprehensive than any of the 3 partners are able to accomplish on their own. It acknowledges shared concerns and shared responsibilities, and it provides multiple tools to address diverse issues. We hope that they're the tools most appropriate to the task. But maximizing the potential benefits of all 3 members of the triad has been difficult. and changes in higher education have put stresses on each component. For all three, there's been the need to deal with rapid changes in delivery methods, online instruction, and in institutional missions and structure and focus and control. Accreditors have had to assume roles outside of their initial purpose of quality enhancement, such as serving as gatekeepers for access to federal and state financial aid. The federal government, through the U.S. Department of Education, has had to deal with explosive and sometimes questionable institutional growth and institutions that have a multi-state footprint, making data availability, as you've heard earlier today, questionable, among many other things. They've also had to deal with intense political pressures on just what kind of regulation is appropriate, who should do it, and how much there should be. States are challenged to provide adequate funding for the review and oversight that they appropriately want to carry out, and statutes often lag in responding to evolving practice. We last year did a thorough review of our statutes dealing with our state oversight of the sector. It's difficult to get statutes through a legislature. This was the first comprehensive review in more than 20 years, and it's a major undertaking. Even in a small state like Nebraska, it's pretty much a major lift. All of this comes at a time when we face fundamental challenges for all three members of the triad, indeed for all of higher education. How can we improve and broaden educational attainment while improving quality and while under financial stress? How can we enable and support the innovation and flexibility in higher ed that our country needs while retaining the ability to restrain and, if needed, deal appropriate with bad actors? But there are some points of common agreement. Interactions between the members of the triad are complex and they're sensitive, and they don't always yield the results we need. That's because each component's imperfect. The efforts of the triad members are sometimes redundant, unduly stressing some institutions and adding to institutions' costs, which are passed on to students. And lastly, despite some degree of oversight from all three perspectives, we still have abuses and shortcomings. Although most countries would take a centralized approach to solving these issues, rightly or wrongly, almost no one in higher education in the United States is now arguing for an increased role for the U.S. Department of Education. Personally, I'm not nearly as opposed to that as are many of my colleagues. Nevertheless, it seems unlikely to occur. I'll focus the rest of my comments more directly on your principal topic, needed and appropriate roles for state oversight of private post-secondary institutions. You've had good testimony today, and despite my research prior to coming, I've learned a good deal about what you do here, and I'm pleased to hear that you're on the right track. Your period of time without having any oversight was dreadful to the rest of us around the country, and we're glad that you're on track to address that. As you know, there are many types of institutions that can be characterized as private post-secondary institutions. You cluster an unusually broad range of institutions under that designation. And for reasons of consumer protection, at least, I believe that it's appropriate for states to have some oversight responsibilities of the sector. But it's also appropriate to regulate different types of institutions differently. Most states take that approach and differentiate between institutions that offer degrees and institutions that offer less than degree programs, programs that lead to certificates or diplomas. They often assign the tasks of that differential regulation to two or more different state agencies, based often upon the level of credential that the institutions award, and in some cases upon the disciplines in which they award them. States draw their distinctions in different ways, but it's fairly common to have that dividing line between degree granting and non-degree granting. It's also reasonably common to use accreditation as a means to lessen the oversight of certain types of institutions or even to exempt them from state oversight, as you do here in California, especially those private institutions that are accredited by one of the 6 regional accreditors. For the reasons that I mentioned above, I personally believe that that approach is far less desirable and effective than the triad approach for many of the reasons that you've heard already in testimony. If not exempted from state oversight by accreditation status, degree-granting schools are generally held to higher expectations than our non-degree granting institutions, including the expectation that they be accredited by an accrediting body recognized by the U.S. Secretary of Education. Personally, again, I believe that all degree-granting schools should be accredited by such an agency. But since new institutions cannot immediately gain accreditation, state oversight agencies need to have and apply a set of standards for new schools that are in effect until appropriate accreditation can be attained. This expectation of accreditation is far less common for the non-degree granting schools. So what kind of regulation is appropriate for them? Most states require both degree granting and non-degree granting schools to meet some standards. You outline those standards in your legislation. I won't detail them here, but they center around some basic issues such as accuracy and transparency in advertising, statements about what the programs of study are intended to accomplish, requirements for data collection, required statements about accreditation status, statements about the likelihood of credits to transfer. That information for all schools, I believe, needs to be made readily available to students. I'm very pleased to hear that you're making large strides into that. I believe that should be for all institutions operating in the state. And today that means availability both in hard copy and online disclosure. At minimum, all public institutions, all post-secondary institutions should report enrollment data, disaggregated by gender, ethnicity, and so forth, term-to-term student retention, graduation rates, change of ownership, and so forth. I believe data requirements should increase for institutions that are shown to present problems for their students, and should lessen over time for institutions that consistently demonstrate good student outcomes. I can't leave this topic without mentioning how this work has changed over the past 15 years or so. We used to have in mind, and I think much of the testimony today has put in your minds, the simple image of a diploma mill preying upon unsuspecting students who were unable to tell the difference between reputable and fraudulent institutions. That still happens, of course, but now we also have so-called students who are really co-conspirators in the process. They want a credential that requires little work on their part and that will help them get or advance in a job, and they're willing to pay for it. A few states have adopted statutes that attempt to deal with that part of the problem, but it largely goes unaddressed. Finally, from my position at a sister agency, I have to lament the closing of your California Postsecondary Education Commission. I believe it's important to have an entity other than the legislature itself that is charged to apply a statewide rather than institution or a sector-specific perspective. It's unfortunate that no longer is the case here in California. I hope if and when your financial situation improves that you'll be able to do something about that. I'd be pleased to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you. And before we go on, Mr. Chairman, just a note, you mentioned CPEC's demise, and we are having a hearing for those who are interested next Wednesday on February 22nd at 2 p.m. on exactly that topic to look at what might succeed CPEC. And now we move to Robert Shireman, from California Competes. He's a former undersecretary at the U.S. Department of Education. Bob, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today and give you my perspective from the perspective of what's happened at the federal level, what we've tried at the federal level to address the issues that we're talking about today. I want to start by, I figure this is appropriate for Valentine's Day. I love the idea of what for-profit colleges can do for students and for the state of California. There is enormous potential for innovation, for a focus on the student, for efficiency to lower costs and bring lower prices, to provide opportunity. There was a mention earlier about a dollar sign on students. The reason we provide financial aid to students is so that colleges and universities see the dollar sign and will offer enrollment to those students, get them through to great outcomes. And when I went into the Obama administration, very beginning of this administration, we were seeing big budget cuts in states all around the country, including California, and at the same time, major growth at for-profit colleges that saw an opportunity to serve students. So our perspective was, let's make sure that students are being served well, and guide that industry in a positive direction, because nationally we need millions more degrees and certificates. California alone, over the next 12 years or so, we need 2 million more degrees and certificates than what we are currently projected to produce. The problem and we're seeing a lot of evidence of this today, is that the invisible hand doesn't always guide the system in a direction that is best for students and taxpayers. And it is not just consumer advocates who say things like this. The CEO of Kaplan University, an online for-profit college, recently in his book said, people can exploit the short-term opportunity for profits that's inherent in the for-profit model in a way that hurts students, taxpayers, and the industry. So I want to talk about the evolution of policy that has attempted to allow the good, positive market forces to thrive while preventing those bad outcomes that can occur, especially, but not exclusively, but especially in for-profit colleges. I wanted to make this concrete, and so I brought my daughter's tuition money with me to help explain kind of where the money goes. So if my daughter gets into the University of California, she's a senior in high school, so I don't know yet. The University of California tuition is about $12,000. So about $10,000, another $12,000. The average tuition at a for-profit college around the country is about $15,000. Now, money is a powerful motivator. And if I am a owner of a for-profit college, let's say, and I want to offer education to students, here's how it might happen. I recruit 100 students. So 100 students times this $15,000 is $1,500,000. I can take $300,000 and hire one full-time faculty member and several adjuncts to provide online education to these students. I might take another $100,000 or so and hire some lawyers and some of the lobbyists that are here to keep lawmakers and accreditors off my back and make sure I've checked all the right boxes and everything, and then another $100,000 for various systems that need to be in place. That's $500,000 of the $1.5 million that comes in from, this might be students who are using student loans and Pell Grants, or Cal Grants and Pell Grants, or private loans and federal student loans, various combinations that reach that $15,000 per student. This $1 million at a for-profit college I can, as a for-profit college owner, just put it in my pocket. What we want to happen in a market kind of situation is we want the fact that I can put that in my pocket to bring others in and say, look, you've got some massive excess profits there. Now, what I might do is, let me figure out how I can grow. Let me take a chunk of this profit, recruit more students, make it 1,000 students, and then I've got $10 million that I can put in my pocket. Other folks are saying, let me see how I can get in this business and offer the same thing that they're offering, and we would hope offer it at maybe a lower price. Obviously, with the actual expenses, it could be offered at a lower price to those students. Or maybe spend more but produce better outcomes, higher graduation rate, or even better, in a state like California where we have employers who are demanding people with high levels of skills in specific industries. For example, we have a large shortage of registered nurses, and we have colleges, public colleges, that don't have the money to spend on the programs to produce those nurses. Best thing that could happen would be for these for-profit colleges to take that $15,000 per student, put together a nursing program, and produce registered nurses. What we are often seeing instead is that the for-profit college puts together a program that is training someone to be a medical insurance billing specialist that they get a certificate in, or a bachelor's degree in office management, something that is not really producing what our workforce needs, but only costs a few $1,000s per student, and therefore keeps that very high level of profit, or money that can come in and then be used to expand to a much, much larger size. So I passed my one sheet of paper that I passed around was a sheet that kind of goes through the various ways that the federal government has attempted to take these dynamics and try to steer them in a direction that is good for students, taxpayers, and for a strong for-profit industry overall. Dr. Hill mentioned that a lot of places they make a distinction based on degree programs versus certificate programs. At the core of some of the original federal financial aid programs is that degree programs are the main focus, and because they tend to be deeper, longer, and lifelong kind of results as compared to certificate programs. The other base level approach to distinguishing between types of programs is public and nonprofit versus for-profit, because in a public and nonprofit situation, there is no owner of the school that is allowed to pocket any of the money. So the bad incentive to have to spend money on a program that isn't any good and isn't providing outcomes that can be driven by the fact that the money can be pocketed doesn't exist in that way in a public or nonprofit institutions. The decisions, it's not that people don't get paid, people who work there get paid, it's that the decisions about how all this tuition money gets spent are made by people who do not have a financial interest in the institution. It's a board of public appointees, or it's a board in a nonprofit situation that by law is required to have a majority of people who don't have a financial interest in the institution itself. So that's a base level. The way that the federal government decided that for-profit institutions could enter and be a part of the federal financial aid system was to say, if they are offering a program that leads to gainful employment in a recognized occupation, then it makes sense to let them be in the program, in large part because it's easier to measure that outcome, to determine, did students actually gain, did the electricians program create an electrician, or the welders program create a welder, or the registered nurses program create a registered nurse. What has happened over time is that for-profit colleges basically made the case that almost any degree can be said to lead to employment somehow, and therefore almost anything that a for-profit college now comes up with is okay. Has the Federal Department of Education just kind of said, well, okay, they made the case that this leads to an occupation. But it definitely, years ago went way beyond what was ever originally intended, which was supposed to be a kind of narrow, restricted zone that could be more easily measured in terms of placement rates and things like that. A second approach that applies, the gainful employment provision applies to any institution that's offering a certificate program. and to almost all the programs at the for-profits, because that's the definition they use to enter the system. Several people have mentioned 90-10, the requirement that some amount of money come from somewhere other than the federal government. And the original idea behind 90-10 wasn't about amounts of revenue. It was, is there anybody who does not have a government voucher who's willing to pay for this product? And how much are they willing to pay? So originally, the GI Bill said, if there aren't people out there who aren't on their own deciding this has value, then we don't want to give a voucher to that person and have them go buy this product. Because how are we going to know that it even is worth the amount that we are giving them? It's to prevent the Department of Defense $1 million hammer kind of thing. What do people pay for hammer who buy them with hammers when they buy them with their own money? That's the original idea behind 90-10, 85-15, which has been really twisted in a way where it is not effective anymore, partly because it's based on revenue rather than people, and partly because it includes the wrong percentage. You've got Cal Grants in the 10% that's supposedly somebody paying on their own. Those are the kinds of things that actually the state could decide, whether state doesn't have to do the same approach to 90-10 and 85-15 as the federal government. The state could actually create what the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs, when this went into effect, said this is a free market mechanism that helps to determine the value of a program. The state could take on that kind of an approach. I'm going to skip over accreditation on this list. Incentive compensation, or the bounties that are paid. This was an attempt. This applies to all colleges and universities. You can't pay people. Basically, you can't tell people, if you can get this person to bring in $15,000 of financial aid, we'll give you $2,000 of it as an advisor of students. Because every recruiter at a college is really supposed to be an advisor. It's supposed to be someone who is just as willing to say, this might not be the right college for you in your current situation, as they are likely to say that this is a good place for you in your current place in life. And when you're dangling a bounty out there for them to get that person enrolled, they become they get very aggressive and eager to enroll that student, and it may not be right for that student. The last thing I wanted to mention is default rates, which have come up today. The federal government has used default rates as a way of saying, okay, on this side of the line, if you've got this many defaults, you're no longer in the program. If you're on that side of the line, you can remain in the program. Default rates have been useful to prevent institutions that are not serving students well, but they are inadequate. And they're inadequate because you would think that, for example, Corinthian Colleges has a 3-year default rate of, I believe it's 36% or so. You would think that that means that, if that's about 1/3, that 2/3 of the students are actually paying off their loans. 1/3 defaulting, 2/3 paying off their loans. In fact, 3/4 are not paying down their loans. All you really need to do to remain out of default on your loans is to remain in communication with the lender. If you're low income, you're unemployed, as long as you sign the piece of paper and say, yeah, I know I owe this, but I'm in dire straits right now, you don't default. So having a high default rate is a sign of a bad institution, but having a low default rate does not necessarily mean that the institution is leading people to great employment where they're actually paying off their loans. And that's why the U.S. Department of Education, in this most recent regulatory effort, said we should look at repayment rates on loans. Are people actually repaying their loans? And what does their debt look like? In their student loan debt look like in comparison to the actual amount they're earning out there in the workforce. those are some of the changes that we implemented when I was at the Department of Education. I appreciate your time today. Happy to answer questions. And the only one request I have for you is that perhaps the Sergeant at Arms could walk me to my car.
Yeah, if you're concerned, you can just leave that with me. And okay, at this point, I'll ask other committee members if they have any questions or comments. Seeing none, I've got a couple of questions, fairly brief. We've heard the term diploma mills a number of times, and Dr. Hill, how do you best identify and protect against however you define diploma mills?
That's a good question. I guess I would define a diploma mill as an institution that intends fraud. It intends to provide a worthless credential, and it intends to get money from students in order for providing that. We used to put all of the blame for that on the side of the institution, and many times that's where it still belongs. But there are also students who willingly provide money to entities that I would call diploma mills. My last public function in Texas was to testify in a district court in Dallas with a diploma mill that called itself Dallas Wesleyan University. Now, that quite rightly got the attention of all the Methodists in northern Texas, and there are quite a few of those. But they were an outright diploma mill. They were advertising that if you provide your life story and a check for $500, you could get a baccalaureate degree. And this was an initiative carried out by the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office. Well, the Texas Attorney General's office was not about to be scooped by the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office, so they instituted an action. But the Pennsylvania AG staffer, when she said in her check and her description of her story, her life story, which she admitted was based on the life story of her cat, overcoming hardships, dealing with adversity, so forth and so on, was told that for an additional $500 she could get not a baccalaureate degree, but a master's degree. Now, that's a diploma mill. That's a diploma mill. I think what we've been talking about today are not diploma mills, but institutions that have varying degrees of allegiance to doing what students need and various degrees of reaction to Mr. Shireman's very pointed demonstration here of what can be done with those funds. I'm a middle-of-the-roader on these issues. We have good for-profit institutions that carry out good functions. I think like all of higher ed, including public higher ed, we can expect more of students and we can deliver more. The challenge is how much to do, how much to expect, what's reasonable, what we can afford to regulate. And I think many states are starting to become aware that they need to pay new attention to this.
Thank you. And a final question. Mr. Chairman, I've got a note here that tells me that you reviewed a book, Change.edu, by Kaplan's Chief Executive, Andrew Rosen, and in your review you questioned whether there really was a role for proprietary institutions. We've heard today about the great demand. Budget cuts have pushed a lot of students in that direction, or students have voluntarily chosen to go in that direction. Explain to us the question whether there is any role at all for proprietary institutions.
Well, I want there to be a role. I feel like the dynamics that can exist are potentially game changers in higher education generally. And that's why I have not been of the mind that that we should just shut them off and say they can't participate. The driver that this provides, while it can provide some real problems, it also causes people to really dig and figure out, how can we do things differently? How can we offer, how can we create, how can we educate a person in a way where they actually maybe learn more than they're learning at a community college or a four-year college or university, and where the future employer notices how much better their critical thinking skills are, their resilience, their entrepreneurship. So I want that powerful driver to work good. After I read Andrew Rosen's book, his book is really mostly about all the waste in public and private higher education and the spending on the climbing walls and all of those kinds of things. But he also spends some time talking about the dynamics of for-profit colleges, and cites the quote I gave about yes, there are some problematic dynamics, but then he also he quotes some of his fellow CEOs of other colleges about what in the book sounds like a relentless pressure from investors, stockholders, saying, how much are you going to grow this quarter? How many students are you going to bring in? And that's okay if they're doing it in a very high quality way. But if it's just all about getting people in the door so they can grab federal aid and then they can sell the stock and earn millions of dollars, that's the negative dynamic that he described. It's not, it's what he described, which is why reading that book made me wonder if it is just this relentless push. I had hoped he would give an example of one where the investors understood that this is something you build over 10, 20 years, and you demonstrate outcomes that are high-quality, long-term outcomes in the workforce. His idea, by the way, as a reform, and maybe the state legislature should take him up on this, he said that investors should be held personally liable for the outcomes of students, I think he said 6 or 7 years beyond the time when they no longer have their investment in the college. In other words, hold the owners personally liable for outcomes. I thought it was an interesting idea. I'm not quite sure how to do it. It also made me wonder, if that's how you make it great, how much trouble are we in that we're not doing that?
Very interesting. Thank you so much. Seeing no other questions for this panel, I want to thank you. I want to thank all the panelists. We're moving now into our final portion of the agenda, and that is public comment. Any members of the public who would like to add testimony, we'll ask that you restrict your testimony to no more than 2 minutes, and please come here. You can have a seat at the table. And we have so far one person. When you do come up, please state your name, any organizational affiliation you wish to tell us about, and give us your 2 minutes.
Good afternoon. My name is John Zimmerman, and I represent MTI College right here in Sacramento. We're accredited as a junior college. And I have to admit, I was sitting in the back here thinking to myself, I just can't take this anymore. And I don't understand why there wasn't a California-based institution sitting at this table amongst the panelists. I've been with MTI College for 35 years. And my whole career has been summed up in this meeting as making me a liar, a cheater, and someone who preys on individuals that need our help. We have individuals that are graduates that are working in this building right now. Within blocks of this institution, there are hundreds of graduates. Within 10 miles, there are thousands of MTI graduates who work. They're gainfully employed. They pay taxes. They pay back their student loans. Do we have people who don't complete the program? Yes. Do we have people who don't pay back their student loans? Yes. Is it the fault of MTI College? Well, I invite any of you to come in and point out where we're not doing it right. We're right down the street here, 10 miles away. Please come in and look at our institution and tell us where we aren't doing it right. We let a student go to school for 30 days before we even certify their student loans. That gives us a chance to see, hey, are they attending? Are they eligible? Should we be doing this? Or should we tell them, hey, this is an opportunity? And we let them to go the first term before we decide whether or not we even want to take their student loan money. There's a difference there is that we may say, you know, John, this isn't the right match for you. You're going to be able to leave here without paying any money whatsoever back in student loans. And we do a lot of other things. But this committee, I know you're trying to do the right thing. I know you're trying to represent the citizens of this state and do the right thing. But let me tell you or share from my wisdom and give you this benefit. The legislation, the regulations that were passed by Congress, implemented by the U.S. Department of Education that Mr. Shireman was involved in, those regulations are what you should be talking about, because the impact on those regulations in the state of California are going to have a tremendous impact. Right now, in this state, you have public and private institutions, community colleges that are in jeopardy of losing their accreditation, private colleges that are going to be losing their accreditation. When you lose your accreditation, you lose your eligibility to participate in financial aid. This is the issue that should be discussed right now, is what is going to be the impact of the new federal regulations. And then you have a bureau that just, my gosh, they've just gotten on their feet. Wonderful, dedicated people trying to do their jobs and to say the least, very shorthandedly. They're just getting ability to get going. And we're here talking about we've got to make this tougher by a very biased panel here. Ladies and gentlemen, you have an opportunity here. And the opportunity is for us all to come together. Is to come together and understand what the challenges are for all the institutions and the federal regulations that have just been put in place. And they're still being worked out. That is the challenge. And that is going to have an impact in your districts with schools closing, both public and private. And I hope that you can do that and focus on that and support the Bureau and give them the people they need to do their job. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you for your testimony. Any other members of the public wish to address the committee?
I'm Paul DeGiusti. I'm Vice President for Government Relations with Corinthian Colleges. We're based in Santa Ana. I wasn't going to come up and say anything, but I wanted to bring a little bit of balance. We're a for-profit as well. We have 3 systems here in California: Everest College, Heald College, and Wyoming Technical Institute right here in West Sacramento. I just wanted to say thank you very much for actually having this hearing. This is the first hearing. I've been involved in the California legislature on these matters since 2005. I wish Mr. Portantino was here because I wanted to thank him for the thankless work that he was involved in getting AB 48 done, as well as the staff members, Ms. Mattoon and Ms. Mason. A lot of subjects were brought up here today by some of the people in this room that some might, have be seen as enemies of our sector. I think it was a very balanced approach. I think that there are a lot of issues that were brought up. There are issues that we're working on constantly. I think Mr. Shireman's, notion about an organization that is trying to, take the dynamics, the market dynamics, to bring in things of, changes to higher education, to post-secondary education, is the organizational kind of mission we're on. So I appreciate that this hearing was had, that the staff put this together. When I saw the agenda, I thought, geez, we're going to get murdered here. We didn't. I think a lot of the, issues that were brought up by people are issues that we work on and that we need to continue to work on, and we will.
Okay, thank you very much for your comment. Next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. Brooks Ellison on behalf of Kaplan. I also want to thank the committee for the review of the hearing. I'll just say a couple of things. Mr. Shireman referenced Andy Rosen's book a couple of times. We appreciate that. It's been well reviewed, including by Bill Gates, and we'd like to enter that review into the record because I think it, really kind of gives a good overview and really talks about innovation and where it's moving. We'd also, I think, like to add into the record that the sector is doing a lot of things in reacting to some of these comments. And one of the things that Kaplan has done is called a Kaplan commitment, which is if you attend Kaplan, you can attend for 30 days. And how it works is, starting the day you attend the program for 30 days. And if for any reason you don't want to continue with that program, so you've got it hands-on, you understand the instructors, you understand what you're doing, you can then withdraw from that, and it doesn't cost you anything other than the $45 application fee. And that's a commitment that Kaplan has made to its students in order to have a meaningful look at the quality of the program and what they're getting into. And they didn't have to do that. I mean, they did it because they thought it was the right thing to do. So we also want to give you an example of some of the things that the private sector is doing for its students, because it's an important mission, and the public sector is not responding because of budget cuts, et cetera, and the private sector is, and it needs to remain innovative. And I think the Kaplan commitment is evidence of some of those innovations. And I think Mr. Rosen's book is also a good description of keeping that innovation alive. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Are there any other members of the public who wish to comment? Okay, in that case, we will close public comment. Do any members of the committee wish to make any closing statements? Seeing none, I will thank you all for attending. We have a lot more work to do in this area, and we appreciate your cooperation and input. This meeting is adjourned.